I'm about to show you some phrases that you should fill in the blank. First one is, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the. If you filled in with cell, then you are correct. Let's try it again. The Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals. If you guessed c squared, then you're also correct. These two phrases are something that you should have learned in high school. Let's try this again, but with a question that you should have also learned the answer to in high school. Let's say you have a basic savings account that earns 1% interest every year. If inflation is 2% one year, by the end of that year, will you have more, less, or the same purchasing power? If you guessed less, then you are correct. Like I said, all of these phrases in question are stuff that you should have learned in high school. However, you might have not actually learned the answer to the last question, and that is because California doesn't require students to learn about finance. Finance and money-making decisions are stuff that we have to deal with every day. However, it's not taught in high schools. I was born and raised in Mexico by my single mom, and I watched her struggle a lot financially due to her ignorance about finance. Looking back, a lot of the problems that we dealt with could have been easily avoided if she had just had basic knowledge about finance. So that's why I believe that California should mimic Utah's House Bill 286 that requires high schools to have one semester of basic finance. So in this speech, first I will tell you about some of the problems that California and the US are facing due to financial ignorance. Secondly, I will tell you about some of the reasons why people believe that we shouldn't have finance taught in schools. And lastly, I will tell you about what you can do today to help fix this problem. So I'll begin by telling you about California's and the US problems. So what you're seeing is a chart made by the Champlain College in Vermont. They looked at how many instructional hours of finance and the quality that each state has, and they graded them based on their performance. So as you can see, Utah, the state whose bill we're trying to mimic, got an A, and California is down at the bottom. California literally failed to teach their students about finance. And why does this matter? Well, let me show you. What you're seeing here is a chart made by the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. And they looked at how many California consumers actually compared credit cards when shopping for them. As you can see, 60% of California consumers did not compare credit cards when shopping for them. This literally means that they took the first deal they were given and were clearly targeted by the marketing companies of the credit card companies. Sorry. But let's see, and this doesn't end here. What you're seeing here is a chart made by the Federal Reserve Board, and from a survey that they found out that in 2020, 37% of Americans can't cover a $400 emergency expense. What this means is that literally over a third of American adults can't cover a $400 emergency expense. And as we know, emergencies can rack up to much more than $400. And the fact that over a third of Americans can't cover that without having to sell or borrow money is a problem. Let's see, one more. According to UC Berkeley, 53.4% of California's private employees don't have a retirement savings account or a pension. So what that means is that over half of California's private sector employees don't have a 401k or a Roth IRA, and they're not putting money aside for their future. And putting money aside for retirement is something that can easily be taught in finance and should be put in our children's heads early on so that they don't have to deal with retirement problems when they get older. What we're going to see in the next few coming years is that a lot of people are going to have a hard time retiring. That is, if they get to retire at all. So now that I've talked to you about some of the reasons why California needs financial education, I'm going to tell you why some people don't believe that we need them. The first one is that some people believe that finance should be taught at home. And I agree, finance should be taught at home. However, it should have been taught at home all these years, and we still have all the problems that I mentioned above. And just because it should be taught at home, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be taught in schools. So this is a flawed argument. There's a lot of stuff that we can teach our students, such as budgeting, taxes, income, that it can also be taught at home. So there's no reason that should not be a deterrent for us not to enforce it being taught in our high schools. The second one is logistics. People say that there aren't enough teachers to teach finance. And that is true. According to a University of Wisconsin-Madison study, it found out that 37% of teachers surveyed had only taken one course in finance throughout their education. So that's a problem as well. That only shows the overall ignorance that our society faces. However, that same study found that 70 or more percent of the teachers were willing to learn. So as we can see, teachers are willing to cooperate with us to make sure that our students are being taught adequately. So that also shouldn't be a problem that comes before, but rather after this bill passes. The last argument is that finance isn't required by standardized colleges or by standardized tests or colleges, so we shouldn't have to teach it in high school. And that is also correct. The SAT, the ACT, or colleges don't have requirements for finance, so why even teach them at all? As we know, high school is supposed to prepare you for college. However, let's not forget that high school in our education system overall is supposed to prepare you for the real world. And we have to make decisions about money every day. And honestly, if even to get into college, a lot of students have to take loans. So that is just a totally flawed argument and it should not be a deterrent for us not to care about finance in our school system. So now that I've told you about some of the reasons why people oppose them, and now that I've refuted them, I'm going to tell you about what would happen if we passed this bill today. What would happen is that we'll see one semester in high school being dedicated to teaching basic finance. School districts will have to prepare and teachers accordingly, and will have to prepare a curriculum, which California has guidelines for. They just don't enforce it. So what we'll see is that California will actually enforce these guidelines towards teaching finance, and we'll have to train teachers accordingly. What we'll see is that students are going to start learning about budgeting, saving, financial investments, banking, taxes, income, retirement, and many more things that are going to be useful later on. So what can we do today to fix this? What we can do, and I want you to do, is I want you to please email Lynn Lorber, the chief consultant of the California Senate Committee on Education, and please demand that we mimic Utah's House Bill 286 so that we can finally get started on teaching our children about finance. So now that I've told you about what you can do, I'm going to recap a little bit on what I've touched on today. First, I told you that California is literally failing to teach our kids about finance. Secondly, I told you that I went on about what problems California and the US are facing from an ignorance, because of the ignorance in finance, and some of the problems that we're going to face later on due to the retirement issue. Then I told you about why people believe that finance should only be taught at home and how that is a flawed argument. And the second one about how there aren't enough teachers and that is something that can be fixed, and how just because colleges and standardized tests don't require it, it shouldn't mean that we can't teach our kids about finance. Lastly, I told you about what you can do today, and let me bring you back to it. Please email Lynn Lorber and demand that we mimic Utah's House Bill 286, forcing high schools to teach one semester of finance. Because finance is something that we use every day and should be and basic education about finance is something that should be tattooed in our children's heads, just like the Pythagorean theorem and the mitochondria. Thank you very much.